It began not with an explosion, but with a whisper, the slow whir of a Huey helicopter slicing through a green inferno. Beneath it, young men trudged through the thick jungle of Quang Tri, soaked in rain and disbelief, eyes darting for enemies they could never see. The jungle was alive, humid, breathing, and unforgiving. And yet, it wasn't the jungle that would destroy them. It was the decisions made 10,000 miles away, in air-conditioned rooms filled with men in polished shoes and Ivy League confidence. America had come to Vietnam armed with the illusion of control, the belief that data, charts, and strategy could bend history to its will. McNamara's systems analysis, Johnson's gradual escalation, Kennedy's advisors. Words so clean, so measured, that they hid the chaos they would unleash. Each decision was meant to be rational, efficient, even humane. But in the jungle, logic meant nothing. The map did not show the mud. The numbers did not count the fear. By 1968, 500,000 American soldiers were trapped in a war their own leaders couldn't define, fighting an enemy they couldn't see, for a cause they couldn't explain. Every hill taken was abandoned days later. Every bomb dropped created 10 more enemies. The same men who had beaten Hitler thought they could outthink a rice farmer with an AK-47. They called it containing communism. The Vietnamese called it survival. Helicopters came and went, extracting the wounded, the dead, the disillusioned. But what no helicopter could lift was the weight of arrogance, the blind faith that intellect and firepower could replace understanding. The jungle didn't kill America's sons. Washington did. And when the last Huey lifted off from Saigon years later, leaving desperate hands clinging to its skids, it wasn't just soldiers who were left behind. It was a nation's innocence, evaporating into the smoke of a war it never truly understood. The Vietnam War was never just a military conflict. It was a test of America's soul, and it failed spectacularly. The war revealed the fragility behind the myth of American infallibility, proving that even the world's most powerful nation could drown in its own illusions. Behind every decision, memo, and speech, there was a desperate attempt to preserve credibility, to prove that America, once committed, could never be wrong. But history has a way of punishing arrogance. The decisions that escalated the war, from the Gulf of Tonkin to Operation Rolling Thunder, were not simply tactical errors. They were moral ones. They exposed a government so consumed by fear of losing face that it forgot why it was fighting in the first place. This story is not about battlefields or body counts. It's about rooms filled with certainty and the men who mistook confidence for wisdom. Vietnam was not lost in the jungle. It was lost in Washington, in the quiet hum of projectors, the shuffle of briefing papers, and the echo of men convincing themselves they were right. The architects of America's Vietnam decisions were not monsters. They were, in many ways, the embodiment of their generation's faith, in reason, in technology, and in the power of intellect to conquer chaos. John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Robert McNamara were products of post-war America, polished, pragmatic, and deeply confident in the idea that democracy could be engineered as neatly as a highway system. Kennedy, educated at Harvard, was a Cold War idealist who saw every geopolitical challenge through the prism of image and perception. He inherited the domino theory, that one nation falling to communism would trigger the collapse of an entire region, and he believed in America's duty to stop it. But Kennedy's confidence in the American model blinded him to the complexities of Vietnam's history. To him, South Vietnam wasn't a centuries-old society fighting for independence. It was another square on the global chessboard. Then came Lyndon B. Johnson, a man driven not by ideology, but by obsession. He saw Vietnam not as a moral cause, but as a test of American credibility. Losing it, he feared, would unravel his presidency and the nation's standing. Johnson, once the architect of the Great Society, became consumed by the fear of being the first U.S. president to lose a war. His war room became a theater of insecurity, his decisions wrapped in paranoia and pride. And at the heart of it all stood Robert McNamara, the technocrat who believed war could be quantified, that human lives could be reduced to data points and efficiency ratios. He had managed Ford Motor Company, turning chaos into order with precision and mathematics. When Kennedy brought him into the Pentagon, McNamara applied the same logic to Vietnam. He believed that if you could measure progress, by sorties flown, bridges bombed, bodies counted, you could win. But Vietnam was not a corporation, and its people were not statistics. The brilliance of America's best and brightest became their curse. They were so intelligent that they mistook calculation for understanding. Their failure was not in strategy, but in empathy. An inability to see that what they were trying to manage was not a problem, but a people. By the early 1960s, Washington had become a temple of intellect and ambition, a place where theories, not truths, ruled. The men shaping Vietnam policy weren't soldiers hardened by war. They were professors, lawyers, and strategists who believed they could outthink history itself. They came from Harvard, Yale, MIT, the bastions of American brilliance. Journalists later called them the best and the brightest. It wasn't meant as praise. In the corridors of the Pentagon and the West Wing, decisions about Vietnam were born in the friction between fear and pride. Kennedy, still haunted by the Bay of Pigs disaster, believed a display of strength in Southeast Asia could restore America's credibility. His inner circle, McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, Dean Rusk, saw Vietnam as a chess move against the Soviet Union, not as a war among Vietnamese for their own destiny. After Kennedy's assassination, Johnson inherited both the war and the illusion of control. He surrounded himself with the same brilliant minds, men who knew how to calculate troop deployment ratios, but not how to understand the human cost of occupation. The domino theory became their religion. If Vietnam fell, they warned, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and the Philippines would follow. To them, not acting was unthinkable. But behind the polished briefings and PowerPoint-like projections was something far more primitive: the politics of fear. Johnson's 1964 election campaign painted Barry Goldwater as a dangerous warmonger. Ironically, once elected, Johnson expanded the war far beyond anything Goldwater had proposed. He felt trapped, cornered between hawks demanding escalation and doves accusing him of cowardice. The White House became a bunker of anxiety, where every memo began with strategy and ended with politics. Meanwhile, McNamara's Pentagon built an empire of data. Computer models predicted outcomes, analysts measured kill ratios and sortie efficiency. The war became an equation, but the equation had no variable for human resolve. The North Vietnamese didn't fit the model. They weren't collapsing, they were adapting. And in that disconnect between power and understanding, between theory and terrain, the US government built its own labyrinth. The more it tried to justify the war, the deeper it sank into it. The alliance between the White House, the Pentagon, and academia had created not just policy, but a machine of delusion, a perfect system designed to perpetuate its own failure. By the time anyone questioned the machine, it was too late. Vietnam had already become more than a war. It was a mirror, reflecting back everything America refused to see about itself. It began with a lie, or perhaps a convenient misunderstanding. On August 4th, 1964, the White House announced that North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Within hours, President Johnson appeared on television, somber and resolute, declaring that aggression would not go unanswered. What the public didn't know was that the second attack likely never happened. Radar echoes had been mistaken for enemy vessels. But in Washington, the illusion of certainty was more powerful than truth. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution sailed through Congress almost unanimously, giving Johnson the authority to wage war without a formal declaration. It was a blank check, and the president signed it with history's ink. Within months, U.S. involvement escalated from advisory support to full-scale combat. Thousands of American troops landed in Da Nang, stepping onto a war that was never theirs to win. Then came Operation Rolling Thunder, the longest sustained bombing campaign in U.S. history. The strategy was simple: bomb North Vietnam until they surrendered. Between 1965 and 1968, the United States dropped more than 3 million tons of explosives, more than it had used in all of World War II. Bridges, supply lines, and villages vanished under firestorms of napalm and cluster bombs. But instead of breaking Hanoi's will, the campaign steeled it. The North Vietnamese rebuilt faster than they were destroyed. Meanwhile, in the South, the U.S. adopted General Westmoreland's search and destroy strategy. Villages were cleared, burned, and counted as pacified. Success was measured by body count, not by stability. Each week, reports from Saigon claimed progress, but progress was a grotesque illusion. The same hills were fought over, lost, and retaken in endless cycles. The war became a treadmill of death, always moving, never advancing. Behind the scenes, doubts grew. McNamara began to suspect that the data he trusted was lying to him. The fog of war, he would later call it, though it wasn't fog. It was smoke from his own logic burning itself down. The Pentagon's models said the war was winnable. The field reports said otherwise. But in Washington, numbers still spoke louder than blood. Then came the Tet Offensive of 1968, the moment everything shattered. On the eve of the Vietnamese New Year, over 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers launched coordinated attacks across more than 100 cities, including Saigon itself. The assault stunned the world, not because it captured territory, but because it shattered the illusion of American progress. For years, Johnson's administration had insisted that victory was near. Tet proved it was a lie. Even though the offensive was a military failure for the North, it was a psychological catastrophe for the United States. Television brought the war home. Images of burning embassies, dead soldiers, and chaos on streets Americans had been told were secured. In that moment, the American public realized something profound. Their leaders weren't just losing the war, they were lying about it. Within months, McNamara resigned, broken and disillusioned. Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The war machine continued under Nixon, but its soul had already collapsed. The decisions that led to Vietnam were made by men who thought they were defending freedom. What they defended instead was pride, and pride demands sacrifice. Theirs came in the form of 58,000 American dead, millions of Vietnamese lives lost, and a nation forever haunted by the echo of helicopters leaving rooftops in defeat. In the sterile glow of the Pentagon's projectors, Vietnam had always looked manageable. Numbers made it so, graphs rising and falling like the stock market, maps dotted with red and blue indicators. But reality has a cruel habit of defying prediction. The Vietnam War exposed the limits of America's analytical empire, revealing how intellect without understanding can be more dangerous than ignorance itself. The policy was rooted in a single assumption: that superiority in technology, logistics, and firepower would inevitably lead to victory. It was a comforting illusion, one that made sense in conference rooms but disintegrated in the jungles of Khe Sanh. The U.S. military, trained for industrial-scale warfare, found itself fighting an enemy that refused to play by its rules. The Viet Cong didn't occupy territory, they occupied time. They fought to outlast, not outgun. America's strategic thinking turned war into arithmetic. Body count became the measure of success. If more enemy soldiers died than Americans, it meant progress, or so the charts said. But that equation ignored the moral corrosion beneath it. Villages were razed, civilians killed, and entire provinces declared secure only to fall again days later. For every enemy combatant neutralized, 10 more were created from grief and rage. The doctrine of attrition warfare, wearing down the enemy until he breaks, failed because the North Vietnamese were not fighting to win. They were fighting not to lose. And in that kind of war, the side that can endure the most suffering always triumphs. Politically, the war eroded trust in the very institutions meant to uphold democracy. Johnson's administration, terrified of public backlash, buried casualty reports and distorted data. The Pentagon knew the war was unwinnable years before it ended. But the machinery kept turning, because to stop would be to admit defeat. And in the American psyche of the 1960s, defeat was unthinkable. Economically, the war bled the nation dry. Over $168 billion spent, inflation soaring, domestic programs gutted. The Great Society Johnson promised became the Forgotten Society, sacrificed on the altar of foreign credibility. The war that was supposed to defend democracy abroad ended up corroding it at home. But perhaps the most profound consequence was spiritual. Vietnam broke something inside America: the myth of moral invincibility. For the first time, Americans began to question not only their government, but their purpose. The generation that once believed in destiny came to believe in doubt. And long after the helicopters left Saigon, the lessons refused to fade. Yet, as history would later show in Iraq and Afghanistan, those lessons were learned and then forgotten, over and over again. By the late 1960s, the war had spread beyond the jungles of Vietnam, into the living rooms, universities, and streets of America itself. What had begun as a faraway conflict now flickered on every television screen, unfiltered and raw. Images of napalm-scorched children and body bags lined up on airstrips pierced the myth of American righteousness. The country that once sold itself as the defender of freedom had become the aggressor in the eyes of its own people. The anti-war movement began modestly, students holding teach-ins at Berkeley, small protests outside draft offices. But by 1968, it had become a nationwide uprising. Millions marched through Washington and New York, demanding an end to what they called a rich man's war fought by the poor. Soldiers began refusing orders. College campuses erupted in fire and tear gas. The chants, "Hell no, we won't go," echoed louder than the drums of war. When Martin Luther King Jr. denounced the war in 1967, calling it a cruel manipulation of the poor, he shattered the illusion that civil rights and foreign policy were separate struggles. The White House saw it as betrayal, but King saw clearly. A government spending billions on bombs while neglecting justice at home had lost its moral compass. Then came the ultimate rupture: the Pentagon Papers. In 1971, a former defense analyst named Daniel Ellsberg leaked 7,000 pages of classified documents, revealing that successive administrations, from Kennedy to Nixon, had systematically lied about the war's progress. The truth was staggering. They had known for years that victory was impossible, yet continued sending men to die. Nixon's response was paranoia disguised as patriotism. His administration launched covert operations to silence critics, spy on journalists, and smear opponents. What began as a war abroad had now become a war within, between a government desperate to preserve its image and a public no longer willing to believe it. By the early 1970s, America was no longer united by ideals, but divided by suspicion. The Vietnam War had devoured more than lives and money. It had devoured trust itself. The same nation that claimed to be saving democracy in Asia was now struggling to keep it alive at home. When the last helicopter lifted off from the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon on April 30th, 1975, it carried more than frightened diplomats. It carried the death of an illusion. The illusion that America's power was boundless, its cause always righteous, and its leaders always right. The Vietnam War left behind not only a shattered country halfway around the world, but a wound in the American psyche that would never fully heal. In the years that followed, the term Vietnam Syndrome entered the national vocabulary, a collective fear of military intervention, a hesitation to believe that America could, or should, police the world again. For decades, it haunted policymakers. Presidents invoked it with dread, generals tried to exercise it with new doctrines, and citizens carried it like a scar. The returning veterans were welcomed not with parades, but with silence. They had fought in a war their country wanted to forget. Many came home broken, addicted, or alienated, symbols of a nation at war with its own conscience. The government's attempt to bury the trauma only deepened it. Culturally, Vietnam changed everything. It birthed a generation of skepticism, filmmakers, journalists, and thinkers who questioned the narratives of power. The faith that had once fueled American exceptionalism gave way to irony, cynicism, and a quiet kind of mourning. The Vietnam War became more than history. It became a mirror. And yet, the irony of legacy is repetition. Decades later, when U.S. troops entered Iraq and Afghanistan, echoes of Vietnam could be heard in every press conference and every promise. This time will be different, they said. It wasn't. The lessons of Vietnam, about hubris, about the futility of trying to engineer another nation's destiny, were remembered just long enough to be ignored again. But perhaps that's the truest legacy of Vietnam. The reminder that even the most powerful empire can lose not to its enemies, but to its own certainty. The war didn't end on a battlefield. It ended in the American mind, a war between what the nation believed it was and what it had become. In the grainy footage of that final day in Saigon, the camera trembles as desperate hands reach for the skids of a departing helicopter. The sound of the rotors drowns out the cries, a mechanical heartbeat of a nation fleeing its own shadow. For many Americans, it was just another distant image from the evening news. But for history, it was the sound of something ending. Not just a war, but an era of certainty. For 3 decades after World War II, the United States had seen itself as the architect of freedom, the guardian of global order. Vietnam shattered that illusion. It forced Americans to confront a truth few wanted to face, that moral conviction is not the same as moral clarity, and power does not guarantee wisdom. The men who led the war weren't villains, they were believers. And belief, when untested by humility, becomes its own form of blindness. Every generation since has returned, in one way or another, to the ghost of Vietnam, to the questions it raised and never answered. What does it mean to fight for freedom abroad while losing faith at home? How do you measure victory in a war that was never meant to be won? The last image of Saigon, that helicopter rising into a smoky sky, endures because it wasn't just about leaving Vietnam. It was about leaving behind the idea that America could bend the world to its will without breaking itself in the process. In Vietnam, America didn't simply lose a war. It lost something far more fragile, its belief that it could never be wrong.